The turbulent foundation. Rebecca Carrington had built her career as a flight attendant on the foundations of discipline, composure, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining the luxury image of SkyVantage Airlines. For nearly 2 decades, she had navigated the skies, catering to the world's elite, where perfection wasn't just expected, it was demanded. SkyVantage was renowned for its seamless first-class experience, plush leather seats, curated gourmet meals, and a cabin crew that embodied poise and refinement. Rebecca relished her position of authority in this world of exclusivity. She knew the regulars, the tech moguls, entertainment icons, and politicians who frequented her flights. She prided herself on treating them with an elegant balance of deference and control, ensuring every detail of their journey was impeccable. To Rebecca, first class wasn't merely a section of the plane. It was a sanctum reserved for those who had earned the privilege. On a brisk winter evening, Flight 943 from New York to Paris was scheduled for departure. The flight promised a routine voyage, with most first-class seats occupied by familiar faces. Rebecca, dressed immaculately in her tailored uniform, stood at the boarding gate, scanning each passenger's ticket with a practiced air of professionalism. Her sharp eyes flickered across the crowd, assessing demeanor, attire, and, unspokenly, status. Among the throng of passengers, a family caught her attention. James and Monica Bennett stepped forward with their 2 young children, each clutching the small backpack. Their appearance was neat and understated, James in a fitted navy blazer and Monica in a flowing emerald dress. Their children, a boy and girl no older than 7, were unusually quiet, their wide eyes taking in the grandeur of the gate area. Rebecca's practiced smile faltered for a split second. Something about the Bennetts unsettled her. Their confidence as they approached the first-class line seemed mismatched with their modest attire. Her gaze lingered on the children's backpacks, simple and scuffed, a stark contrast to the designer luggage typically seen in first class. She couldn't explain the feeling, but an instinctive alarm rang in her mind. As they reached the counter, Rebecca's voice remained calm but carried a subtle edge. "Good evening. May I see your boarding passes?" James handed over the tickets with a cordial smile. "Of course." Rebecca's eyes scanned the electronic passes, confirming their first-class designation. Yet, a part of her resisted the conclusion. Something felt amiss. "One moment, please," she said, stepping aside to consult her supervisor. The Bennetts exchanged a glance, their smiles fading into thinly veiled unease. Monica crouched to whisper words of reassurance to their children, while James stood straight, his expression impassive. Passengers behind them began shifting uncomfortably, the delay sparking quiet murmurs. Rebecca returned, her smile now strained. "There seems to be a minor issue with your seating arrangement. Please follow me." She led the Bennetts through the plane, bypassing the lavish first-class section they'd anticipated, and gestured to seats at the very back of the first-class cabin. These seats, while technically within the premium area, were adjacent to the curtain dividing first class from economy, a subtle demotion that left no doubt about its intent. "This will be your seating area for the flight," Rebecca announced curtly. "If you need assistance, feel free to let us know." James narrowed his eyes slightly but remained composed. "Thank you," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Monica gave a polite nod, ushering their children into the seats. Rebecca walked away, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. In her mind, she had done her duty to maintain the integrity of the first-class experience. Yet, as she resumed her pre-flight preparations, she couldn't shake the lingering discomfort their presence stirred in her. The Bennetts, now seated, settled into the cramped confines of their reassigned row. Monica leaned in close to James, her voice low but firm. "You noticed it too." James nodded, his expression tight. "It's not subtle." Their children, sensing the tension, remained unusually quiet. Monica reached for her daughter's hand, offering a reassuring squeeze. "Let's not let this ruin the trip," she whispered. James gave her a small, strained smile, but his jaw remained clenched. The flight began without further incident. Rebecca returned to her duties, ensuring the elite passengers received their customary champagne and canapés. She avoided looking toward the Bennetts, determined to keep them out of her mind. Yet, as the flight progressed, she found her gaze drifting toward their row. To her frustration, the family was quietly composed. James reading, Monica helping her son with a coloring book, and their daughter fast asleep. Why did their calm demeanor bother her so much? Rebecca couldn't explain it, but the nagging discomfort persisted. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, another first-class passenger had noticed her treatment of the Bennetts. A distinguished older man, seated near the middle of the cabin, had observed the delay at boarding and the conspicuous reassignment of their seats. His sharp eyes didn't miss the subtle disdain in Rebecca's demeanor or the Bennetts' quiet dignity in response. He made no immediate move, opting instead to watch and weigh the situation carefully. Rebecca's unease grew as the flight continued. Despite her best efforts to maintain her usual composure, the presence of the Bennetts felt like a thorn in her side. Every glance at their row felt like a silent challenge to her authority, though they had done nothing overt to provoke her. She confided her frustrations to Melissa, a newer flight attendant, in hushed tones during a break in the galley. "I just don't get it," Rebecca muttered. "They don't fit. I've seen this before. People scamming their way into first class. It's not right." Melissa, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before replying. "But they had valid tickets, didn't they?" Rebecca rolled her eyes. "That doesn't mean they belong here." Melissa didn't push the matter, but her uneasy expression lingered in Rebecca's mind. As the hours passed, the Bennetts remained quiet, their patience unshaken despite slow service, and Rebecca's frosty demeanor. James occasionally glanced at his wife, exchanging subtle, knowing looks. Their composure, far from appeasing Rebecca, only intensified her irritation. By the time the dinner service began, Rebecca had convinced herself that she was justified in her treatment of the family. Yet, a small, unshakable doubt had begun to creep into her mind. Something about this situation felt different. What that difference was, however, eluded her. Little did Rebecca know, her carefully constructed world of control and perception was about to be dismantled in a way she could never have anticipated. Tension at 30,000 feet. The first-class cabin of Flight 943 hummed with subdued luxury. Passengers lounged in their plush leather seats, sipping champagne, exchanging low murmurs, or scrolling through their devices. The mood was serene, at least for most. For Rebecca Carrington, however, it was anything but. She prowled the cabin like a hawk, her polished demeanor a thin veil over her simmering unease. Something about the Bennett family unsettled her deeply. Their quiet confidence clashed with the usual obsequiousness she expected from first-class passengers. It wasn't arrogance. They were courteous and unassuming. Yet their very presence felt disruptive, as if they challenged the exclusivity she worked so hard to uphold. Rebecca's colleagues, especially Melissa, had noticed her growing tension. Melissa, inexperienced but perceptive, ventured a cautious suggestion as they prepared drinks in the galley. "Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else. It's not like they've done anything wrong." Rebecca shot her a sharp look, her voice low but cold. "You don't understand. This isn't just about tickets. It's about maintaining standards. First class is an experience, not just a seat." Melissa opened her mouth to reply but thought better of it, returning her focus to the task at hand. Rebecca, meanwhile, was stewing. She couldn't articulate why the Bennetts felt out of place to her. There was no evidence, just instinct. And Rebecca trusted her instincts. James Bennett adjusted his seat, leaning toward his wife, Monica. "They're watching us," he whispered, his tone calm but tinged with frustration. "I know," Monica replied, her voice steady. She looked down at her daughter, who was coloring with quiet focus. "But we're not here to prove anything. Let's just get to Paris and enjoy our trip." James exhaled sharply but nodded. He reached for his phone, scrolling through emails to distract himself. Monica, ever the anchor, placed a reassuring hand on his arm before turning her attention to their children. It wasn't their first experience with this kind of treatment, but it never got easier. James felt the weight of Rebecca's judgment every time she passed their row. It wasn't overt, just a slight tightening of her expression, a deliberate delay in responding to their requests. It was enough to send a clear message: you don't belong here. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, her actions had not gone unnoticed by the other passengers. In particular, a sharply dressed man in his late 50s, seated near the middle of the first-class cabin, had been quietly observing her behavior. William Carter, a senior executive for a prominent global consulting firm, was no stranger to subtle power dynamics. He recognized the signs of microaggressions when he saw them, and Rebecca's treatment of the Bennetts was glaringly obvious. When Rebecca walked by his seat, William flagged her down with a casual wave of his hand. "Excuse me, miss." Rebecca stopped, her professional smile snapping into place. "Yes, sir. How can I assist you?" William gestured subtly toward the back row where the Bennetts were seated. "I couldn't help but notice that family service has been delayed compared to the rest of us. Is there a reason for that?" Rebecca's smile faltered, and a faint blush crept up her neck. "I assure you, sir, all passengers are treated equally in first class. We're simply a bit behind on their row." William raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "Interesting, because it doesn't seem that way. If I didn't know better, I'd think there was some sort of issue." Rebecca stiffened, forcing her smile to stay in place. "I apologize if it appeared that way. I'll ensure their needs are addressed promptly." William nodded, but his piercing gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Good. I'd hate to think Skyvantage's reputation for impeccable service was slipping." With that, he turned back to his drink, leaving Rebecca with a sour taste in her mouth. She clenched her hands behind her back, her frustration bubbling dangerously close to the surface. How dare he insinuate that she wasn't doing her job? He doesn't understand the bigger picture, she told herself. But even as she tried to justify her actions, a seed of doubt had been planted. Was she being too harsh? Was she letting her personal biases cloud her judgment? The questions gnawed at her, but she brushed them aside. Rebecca wasn't about to let one passenger, or one family, undermine her authority. As the flight attendants prepared for dinner service, Rebecca found herself watching the Bennetts once again. James was reading a book, his expression calm and unreadable. Monica was helping their son with a puzzle while their daughter dozed off against her shoulder. They weren't demanding or disruptive. In fact, they were quieter and more composed than many of the other passengers. And yet Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong. She deliberately delayed serving their row during dinner, ensuring that every other passenger received their meals first. When she finally approached, her tone was clipped, and her smile was perfunctory. "I apologize for the delay," she said, setting their trays down with a bit more force than necessary. Monica met her gaze, her expression serene but unwavering. "Thank you," she said politely, her tone neutral. James nodded, his eyes briefly locking with Rebecca's. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a quiet strength that made Rebecca feel inexplicably unsettled. Meanwhile, William Carter continued to watch the interaction with growing curiosity. He had spent years navigating high-stakes negotiations and reading people's unspoken intentions. It was clear to him that the Bennetts were no ordinary passengers, and Rebecca's behavior was only adding to his intrigue. Back in the galley, Melissa couldn't hold her silence any longer. "Rebecca," she said hesitantly, "maybe we should ease up. They're not causing any trouble." Rebecca rounded on her, her voice low and sharp. "Melissa, you're new, so let me explain something. This isn't just about one flight. It's about maintaining the image of first class. If we let standards slip, we'll lose what makes us different from every other airline." Melissa frowned but didn't argue further. Rebecca turned away, her jaw set. She had no intention of changing her approach. As the plane soared through the night sky, the Bennetts remained calm, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to Rebecca's growing frustration. James leaned over to Monica and whispered, "She's not going to change. You see that, right?" Monica smiled faintly. "Let her dig her own hole," she replied softly. "We're not here to prove anything. Let's just get through this flight." James nodded, but his eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin, where Rebecca was speaking with another passenger. His mind was already working, considering his next move. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but he also wasn't one to let disrespect slide without consequences. Rebecca had no idea that her actions were being closely monitored, not just by William Carter but by the Bennetts themselves. And as the plane hurtled toward Paris, the stage was quietly being set for a reckoning that would leave Rebecca questioning everything she thought she knew about her job, her passengers, and herself. A shift in the air. As the flight stretched into its third hour, the tranquil rhythm of the first-class cabin persisted for most of the passengers. They sipped on their drinks, nibbled on gourmet desserts, and leaned back in their reclining seats to enjoy their in-flight entertainment. But for Rebecca Carrington, tranquility was far from reach. The Bennetts, despite their quiet and composed demeanor, seemed to radiate a presence that unsettled her. Rebecca had always prided herself on being able to read people. In her years of flying, she'd encountered celebrities with fragile egos, entitled business tycoons, and first-time flyers who fumbled with every amenity. She could handle them all with poise and precision. But the Bennetts, they defied her expectations. Their calm was not the result of naivety. It was something deeper, something that Rebecca could not place. James Bennett reclined slightly in his seat, his arm resting protectively around his sleeping daughter. He cast a glance at Monica, who was flipping through a magazine with an air of unbothered elegance. It wasn't an act. Monica had always carried herself with quiet grace, even in the face of adversity. James admired that about her. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded, looking up from the glossy pages. "I'm fine. The kids are fine. And you?" James smiled faintly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been better, but I'll let this play out." Monica reached for his hand and squeezed it gently. "We always rise above, remember?" He nodded again, his jaw tightening slightly. James wasn't a confrontational man, but he knew when to stand his ground. And while he had no intention of causing a scene on the flight, he had already decided that this slight would not go unanswered. Rebecca, meanwhile, was doing her best to focus on her duties, but every time she glanced toward the Bennetts, her irritation resurfaced. She noticed how other passengers occasionally turned their heads to look at the family, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet sympathy. It was subtle, but Rebecca could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. The Bennetts were no longer invisible. "Rebecca," Melissa's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I think we should offer them dessert. Maybe something extra, to smooth things over." Rebecca frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Smooth things over? We haven't done anything wrong." Melissa hesitated, then gestured toward the Bennetts' row. "I don't think it's about right or wrong. I just think it might be kind." Rebecca rolled her eyes. "This isn't a charity, Melissa. First class is earned, not given. They're getting the same service as everyone else." Melissa wanted to argue, but she held her tongue. It wasn't her place to challenge Rebecca's authority, at least not directly. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the airline's finest moment. A few rows ahead, William Carter put down his whiskey glass and leaned back in his seat. He had been observing Rebecca's behavior throughout the flight, and it had grown increasingly difficult to ignore. He had seen this kind of treatment before, albeit in boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. It was the subtle, insidious kind of prejudice that people like Rebecca likely didn't even realize they were perpetuating. William had no connection to the Bennetts, but their quiet dignity had impressed him, and Rebecca's thinly veiled hostility had stirred something in him, an urge to intervene. Dinner service had ended, and the cabin lights were dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight. Most passengers had settled into their seats to sleep or watch movies, Rebecca took the opportunity to retreat to the galley for a moment of reprieve. But even in the dim light, she could feel the tension in the air. Whispers floated through the cabin, low but unmistakable. Passengers had noticed the uneven service, the delayed meals, and the way Rebecca's interactions with the Bennetts lacked the warmth she extended to others. Rebecca didn't need anyone to tell her she was under scrutiny. She could feel the weight of their stares, even if most of them were too polite, or too disinterested, to say anything directly. James, however, had noticed something else. While Rebecca's behavior was irritating, it wasn't the only thing on his mind. His sharp eyes had caught the glances from other passengers. The man in the sharp suit, the elderly woman with pearls, and even the young couple near the front. Their looks weren't of disdain. They were of curiosity and quiet support. He leaned over to Monica and whispered, "I think we have allies." Monica followed his gaze, her lips curving into a subtle smile. "Let them watch. The truth always comes to light." James nodded. He had no intention of making a scene, but he also wasn't going to let Rebecca's behavior go unnoticed. Rebecca, still in the galley, was startled by the sound of someone clearing their throat behind her. She turned to see William Carter standing there, his expression calm but firm. "Miss Carrington," he said, addressing her by her name tag. "Do you have a moment?" Rebecca straightened her posture, her professional mask snapping back into place. "Of course, sir. How can I assist you?" William gestured toward the back row of first class. "I couldn't help but notice that Fanley's experience has been less than exemplary." Rebecca forced a smile, though her irritation was bubbling just beneath the surface. "I assure you, sir, all passengers are treated with the utmost care." William raised an eyebrow, his piercing gaze making Rebecca feel uncomfortably exposed. "Is that so? Because from where I'm sitting, it appears they've been subjected to an entirely different standard." Rebecca's smile wavered. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way. That was not my intention." William studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good. I hope to see their service improve for the remainder of the flight. After all, they're paying the same premium price as the rest of us." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back to his seat. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She wasn't used to being called out, especially not by a passenger. The Bennetts remained composed, even as they noticed William's interaction with Rebecca. Monica gave James a knowing look. It seems we're not alone in this. James chuckled softly. "No, we're not." As the flight continued, Rebecca found herself on edge. Every interaction with the Bennetts felt like a test she couldn't pass. Their calm demeanor only magnified her unease, making her question her own actions in a way she never had before. For the first time in years, Rebecca felt her control slipping. And as the plane soared through the night sky, she began to sense that this flight was far from ordinary. Unmasking intentions, the flight from New York to Paris was now halfway through its journey, and the first-class cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet. The dimmed lights, soft hum of the engines, and muffled sounds of the in-flight entertainment created an ambience of calm. But for Rebecca Carrington, calm was a fleeting illusion. Every interaction, every sideways glance, every whisper seemed to tighten a coil of tension within her. James Bennett stirred in his seat, stretching his legs as he checked on his children. Both were fast asleep, their heads leaning against Monica's shoulders. Monica, ever the steady presence, met his eyes with a small smile. She didn't need to speak. Her expression said it all. "We'll handle this." James returned her smile, but his mind was working. He had spent the past few hours observing the dynamics of the cabin. The stares from other passengers, the pointed yet restrained confrontation by the man in the sharp suit, and Rebecca's increasingly brittle facade, all of it pointed to an undeniable truth. The cracks were showing. James had learned to recognize cracks early in life. In boardrooms, at community gatherings, and even at charity galas, he had seen how people's prejudices and assumptions seeped through, no matter how carefully they tried to hide them. And Rebecca, with her strained professionalism and thinly veiled disdain, was no exception. Rebecca, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley again, her thoughts a swirling mess of frustration and doubt. She had been reprimanded before, but always for small mistakes, serving the wrong wine to a passenger, forgetting to place a blanket on a seat. Never before had her behavior been openly questioned, and certainly not by someone as authoritative as William Carter. She paced the narrow galley, her polished heels clicking softly against the floor. "What's wrong with them?" she muttered under her breath, frustration spilling over. Melissa, who had been restocking snacks, paused and turned to her. "Rebecca, maybe they're just passengers," she offered cautiously. Rebecca whipped around, her eyes narrowing. "Passengers don't make me feel like this." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "Feel like what?" Rebecca hesitated, then crossed her arms. "Like I'm being challenged. Like they don't respect the boundaries of this space." Melissa's expression softened, though her words were firm. "Rebecca, they're just sitting there. Maybe it's not about them." Rebecca blinked, momentarily stunned. But before she could respond, the intercom crackled to life, announcing that the crew would soon dim the lights further as the plane prepared for the overnight portion of the flight. It was a reprieve for Rebecca, though not a comforting one. She decided to busy herself with routine tasks, hoping to regain her composure. In the cabin, William Carter hadn't stopped observing. He noticed how Rebecca avoided the Bennett's row, and how other passengers glanced toward the family with quiet curiosity. He had been in this position before, a silent observer of discrimination that others refused to acknowledge. But this time, something told him that his intervention wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. He leaned back in his seat, sipping his whiskey, and contemplated his next move. He wasn't a man who acted impulsively. Every decision, every action, was calculated. And if there was one thing he despised, it was the misuse of authority. As the cabin lights dimmed further, Monica turned to James. "Are you sure this is worth it?" she whispered. James nodded, his expression resolute. "It's not just about us," he replied. "It's about what this represents." Monica sighed softly, but didn't argue. She had seen James fight battles like this before, always with quiet strength and dignity. It was one of the reasons she had fallen in love with him. She glanced at their children, peacefully unaware of the subtle hostilities unfolding around them, and felt a surge of resolve. If James was going to stand his ground, so would she. Rebecca approached the Bennett's row, a tray of drinks in hand. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Would you like anything else before we begin the overnight service?" she asked, her tone overly polite. Monica looked up, her smile gentle but unyielding. "No, thank you. We're fine." Rebecca nodded curtly and turned to leave, but James spoke up. "Actually, I do have one question," he said. Rebecca stopped, her back stiffening slightly. She turned, her smile now strained. "Yes." James met her gaze evenly. "When will the service equalize?" Rebecca blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry." James leaned back in his seat, his tone calm but firm. "You've served other passengers ahead of us during every phase of the flight. Is there a reason for that?" Rebecca's cheeks flushed. "I assure you, sir, there's been no intentional delay. We're simply following standard procedures." James nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see. And these procedures include serving other rows in first class first." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she gave a tight nod and turned on her heel, walking briskly back to the galley. William Carter, who had overheard the exchange, felt a flicker of admiration for James. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but it was a challenge nonetheless, and it was clear that Rebecca was not prepared for it. The remainder of the flight passed in a tense silence for Rebecca. She avoided the Bennett's row altogether, delegating any interactions to Melissa. But even in her avoidance, she felt their presence like a weight pressing down on her. James, meanwhile, spent the time reading and watching his children sleep. Monica rested her head against his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. It wasn't an outward victory, but James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had made his point without raising his voice, a tactic he had perfected over the years. As the plane began its descent into Paris, Rebecca felt a growing sense of relief. The flight had been a disaster in her eyes, but it was nearly over. She busied herself with preparations for landing, avoiding eye contact with the Bennetts or William Carter. But as the wheels touched down on the tarmac and the passengers began gathering their belongings, Rebecca noticed something that made her stomach drop. James Bennett was speaking with the captain's assistant, his demeanor calm but authoritative. The assistant nodded, her expression serious, before escorting James toward the front of the plane. Rebecca's heart raced. She had no idea what James had said, but she knew it couldn't be good. She forced herself to focus on assisting passengers as they disembarked, her professional mask firmly in place. When the Bennetts reached the exit, James paused, looking directly at Rebecca. His expression was calm, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Thank you for the flight," he said, his voice steady. Monica offered a similar nod, her gaze unyielding. "We appreciate your service," she said, though her tone carried an edge that Rebecca couldn't ignore. Rebecca's smile faltered, and for the first time, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Regret, perhaps, or shame. She watched as the Bennetts stepped off the plane, their heads held high. But the unease in Rebecca's chest didn't fade. It grew, gnawing at her as she realized that this flight wasn't just another routine journey. It was the beginning of something she couldn't yet comprehend, a reckoning she wasn't prepared for. The awakening. The terminal at Charles de Gaulle Airport buzzed with activity as passengers from Flight 943 disembarked into the sprawling modern space. Rebecca Carrington stood at the plane's exit, her polished smile feeling heavier with each farewell she uttered. Most passengers offered polite but perfunctory nods as they passed her, their attention focused on their next destination. But her eyes remained fixated on one figure in particular, James Bennett. James and his family had stepped off the plane with the same composed dignity they had maintained throughout the flight. Yet their departure left a ripple in its wake, one Rebecca couldn't ignore. As the final passenger exited, she turned toward the galley, eager to retreat from the growing unease gnawing at her. In the bustling terminal, James Bennett walked alongside Monica, holding their daughter's hand while their son clutched his mother's. They moved with purpose, their steps steady and deliberate. James's conversation with the captain's assistant during the flight had been brief but significant. "You'll want to know who we are before this goes any further," James had said quietly, handing the assistant his business card. The assistant's eyes had widened as she read the information, her demeanor shifting instantly to one of deference. "Understood, Mr. Bennett," she had replied. Monica glanced at her husband as they made their way through the terminal. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. James nodded, his jaw set. "It's not about us anymore," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Back on the plane, Rebecca busied herself with post-flight duties, but her movements were mechanical. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't shake. What had James said to the captain's assistant? Why had he handed over a business card? And why did she feel an impending sense of dread? Melissa, sensing Rebecca's unease, approached her cautiously. "Are you okay?" Rebecca forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine. Just a long flight." Melissa hesitated, then decided to speak up. "You know, I think they handled everything really well. Considering." Rebecca's expression hardened. "Considering what?" Melissa shrugged, her tone careful. "Considering the way they were treated. They could have made a scene, but they didn't." Rebecca bristled but said nothing. Instead, she focused on organizing her paperwork, her hands trembling slightly. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, but now she felt it slipping away. As the Bennetts reached the arrivals lounge, they were greeted by a small team of staff wearing the unmistakable uniforms of SkyVantage Airlines. The staff members stood in a respectful line, their expressions a mix of professionalism and nervousness. "Mr. Bennett," one of them said, stepping forward, "we've been informed of the situation, and we deeply apologize for any inconvenience you and your family experienced during your flight." James nodded, his expression calm but firm. "I'm not looking for apologies," he said. "I'm looking for accountability." The staff member nodded, their posture stiff. "Of course, sir. We've arranged for a private vehicle to take you to your hotel, and our customer relations team will be in touch to ensure any concerns are addressed." James said nothing more, simply taking Monica's hand and leading their family toward the waiting vehicle. Monica glanced back at the staff, her expression unreadable. She knew this wasn't the end of the matter. It was only the beginning. Rebecca's shift finally ended, and she made her way to the crew lounge, hoping to decompress. But as she entered, she found the atmosphere charged. Several of her colleagues were gathered around a television, watching a breaking news segment. Her stomach dropped as she saw the headline: "SkyVantage Airlines under fire for alleged discrimination against first-class passengers." The screen showed footage of James and Monica Bennett walking through the terminal with their children, their faces calm but resolute. The accompanying commentary detailed complaints about unequal treatment during the flight. Rebecca froze, her mind racing. How did this escalate so quickly? She recognized the power of social media and the speed at which information spread, but she hadn't anticipated this. The man in the sharp suit must have been the catalyst. His quiet observations and pointed remarks were now making sense. Melissa, standing nearby, glanced at Rebecca with a mixture of sympathy and unease. "Looks like it's getting serious," she said softly. Rebecca's chest tightened. She knew she was at the center of the controversy, even if her name hadn't been mentioned yet, and for the first time, she began to question whether her instincts had truly served her or if they had blinded her to her own biases. The next morning, Rebecca woke to a flurry of notifications on her phone. Messages from colleagues, emails from management, and headlines in aviation news outlets all pointed to the same story. The Bennetts were not just any passengers. They were the principal owners of SkyVantage Airlines. James Bennett, as it turned out, was the CEO of Bennett Enterprises, the parent company that owned a controlling stake in SkyVantage. Monica Bennett was an accomplished attorney and the company's chief legal officer. Their presence on the flight had not been a coincidence. It had been an unannounced inspection of the airline services. Rebecca stared at her screen in disbelief. Her face paled as she realized the implications. She had not only mistreated two of the most influential figures in the company, but had also violated the very principles SkyVantage prided itself on. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her supervisor. She hesitated, her fingers trembling before answering. "Rebecca," the voice on the other end said, sharp and professional. "We need to have a meeting. Now." The Bennetts, meanwhile, were preparing for their day in Paris, while their children played in the suite's living room. James and Monica sat at the dining table, reviewing documents. The airline's board of directors had already contacted them, expressing concern over the incident and vowing to take immediate action. "What's the next step?" Monica asked, sipping her coffee. James set down his tablet, his expression thoughtful. "We need to set an example," he said, "not just for Rebecca, but for the entire organization. This isn't about punishment, it's about education." Monica nodded. "Agreed. But we can't let it slide either. This kind of behavior needs to be addressed head-on." James leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "It will be." Rebecca arrived at the meeting room, her heart pounding. Seated across the table were her supervisor, a representative from HR, and to her shock, James and Monica Bennett themselves. James' expression was calm but firm, his eyes locked on Rebecca. Monica sat beside him, her demeanor no less commanding. "Ms. Carrington," James began, his voice steady, "do you know why we're here?" Rebecca swallowed hard, her mind racing for the right words. I understand there were concerns about my behavior on the flight." James raised an eyebrow. Concerns would be an understatement. We observed a pattern of unequal treatment, which goes against everything this airline stands for. Would you care to explain? Rebecca's mouth went dry. She fumbled for a response but found none. Instead, she lowered her gaze, the weight of her actions crashing down on her. Monica leaned forward, her tone calm but cutting. This isn't just about you, Miss Carrington. It's about a culture that allows these behaviors to persist. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? Rebecca nodded, tears stinging her eyes. I do. James exchanged a glance with Monica, then turned back to Rebecca. We're not here to ruin careers, he said. We're here to ensure accountability. You'll undergo mandatory training on diversity and inclusion, and your performance will be closely monitored. If there's no improvement, further action will be taken. Rebecca nodded again, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for the opportunity. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca felt a mix of shame and relief. The Bennetts had given her a second chance, but she knew it came with expectations she couldn't afford to ignore. Outside the meeting room, James and Monica walked side by side, their expressions unreadable. James glanced at his wife and smiled faintly. One step at a time. Monica nodded, her hand brushing his. One step at a time. The aftermath. Rebecca left the meeting room feeling like the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. Her polished exterior, the one she'd meticulously maintained for years, had cracked under the scrutiny of the Bennetts. She had avoided looking directly at them for most of the meeting, unable to meet the calm yet piercing gazes of James and Monica. Their presence was commanding, not because of their titles, but because of the quiet dignity with which they handled the situation. As Rebecca sat in her car in the parking garage, she replayed the events in her mind. The first class's unshaken composure during the flight, James's decisive but calm questions, and Monica's unyielding gaze. All of it gnawed at her. For the first time, Rebecca wasn't just angry at being called out. She was angry at herself. The silence in the car was deafening. Rebecca stared at the wheel, her thoughts racing. What had driven her to treat the Bennetts differently? Was it really her instinct for maintaining the standard of first class, or was it something uglier, something she had never acknowledged about herself? A notification buzzed on her phone, breaking her thoughts. It was an email from SkyVantage's Human Resources Department. The subject line read, Mandatory Training Schedule, Diversity and Inclusion Program. Rebecca sighed, leaning back in her seat. She knew she had to face this head-on. For years, she had taken pride in her ability to maintain control, but now she had to confront the uncomfortable truth. She had been wrong, and her actions had consequences. At the same time, the Bennetts sat in a sleek conference room in SkyVantage's Paris office. The room was filled with the airline's top executives, all eager to address the fallout from the incident. The Bennetts' presence at the meeting was as unexpected as it was intimidating for the staff. While most executives were used to handling issues behind closed doors, James and Monica had insisted on addressing this one personally. James stood at the head of the table, his tone measured but firm. What happened on Flight 943 wasn't just about one flight attendant. It's indicative of a deeper problem in our culture, one that we cannot afford to ignore. Monica leaned forward, her voice carrying a quiet authority. SkyVantage markets itself as a luxury airline that values inclusivity and equality. If we can't live up to that promise, then we're failing every single passenger who trusts us. One of the executives cleared his throat nervously. We've already begun damage control, including a public apology and an internal review process. James nodded. That's a start. But an apology is just words without action. We need systemic changes, training, monitoring, and most importantly, accountability. Monica added, and not just for frontline staff. Leadership needs to lead by example. That includes all of us in this room. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew the Bennetts were right. The incident had already garnered significant attention online, and the airline's reputation was at stake. As the meeting concluded, James and Monica stayed behind for a moment. Monica turned to her husband, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think she'll change?" James shrugged, his tone pragmatic. "I think she's capable of change. But that depends on whether she's willing to confront herself. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight within." Monica nodded, her gaze distant. "I hope she does, not just for her sake, but for everyone she'll interact with in the future." Back in her apartment that evening, Rebecca sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine, scrolling through the news coverage of the incident. She winced at the headlines and the comments, many of which called for her dismissal. But what struck her most were the interviews with other passengers from the flight. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, the same one who had questioned her during the flight, appeared on screen. "The Bennetts handled themselves with grace and dignity," he said. "They didn't demand special treatment. They simply wanted the same respect and service as everyone else." "That's not too much to ask." Rebecca closed her laptop, unable to read more. She stared at the empty wine glass in front of her, feeling the weight of her actions settle deeper. She had spent years convincing herself that she was simply upholding standards, but now she had to ask herself, whose standards were they, and why had they been applied unevenly? A week later, Rebecca arrived at her first diversity and inclusion training session. She walked into the room with trepidation, expecting to feel singled out. But as she sat among her colleagues, she realized the training wasn't about punishment, it was about understanding. The facilitator guided them through discussions about bias, privilege, and empathy, encouraging them to reflect on their own experiences and assumptions. For Rebecca, the session was uncomfortable but eye-opening. She found herself thinking about the Bennetts and the quiet strength they had shown in the face of her mistreatment. She thought about James's pointed questions, Monica's steady resolve, and the way they had carried themselves with dignity, despite her actions. By the end of the session, Rebecca felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: humility. She realized she had been so focused on maintaining control that she had forgotten what her job was truly about: serving others with respect and compassion. Meanwhile, the Bennetts returned to New York after their business in Paris. As they stepped off their private jet, Monica turned to James with a small smile. "Do you think they'll remember this in a year?" James chuckled. "Maybe not, but if we've planted the seeds for change, that's enough." Monica nodded, slipping her hand into his. "One step at a time." James squeezed her hand, glancing at their children, who were running ahead toward their waiting car. "Exactly. One step at a time." The ripple effect. 2 months after the incident on Flight 943, the skies were abuzz with whispers. SkyVantage Airlines had quietly rolled out a company-wide initiative focused on inclusivity and fairness in customer service. Dubbed the Equity and Excellence Program, the initiative wasn't just lip service. It was a bold move led by James and Monica Bennett, who had worked tirelessly with the airline's executives to turn the incident into a catalyst for meaningful change. Rebecca Carrington, once the embodiment of control and poise in the air, found herself at the center of this transformation, not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale. Rebecca's life had changed drastically since the fateful flight. The mandatory training sessions had continued weekly, each one peeling back layers of her defenses. At first, Rebecca approached the sessions with skepticism, feeling as though she was being unfairly punished for a momentary lapse in judgment. But as the weeks went on, something shifted. One session, in particular, struck a nerve. The facilitator had asked the participants to recount a time when they had felt judged or excluded. As her colleagues shared their stories, Rebecca found herself reflecting on her own experiences, ones she had buried for years. She remembered being a young, inexperienced flight attendant, struggling to fit in among a crew that seemed effortlessly polished and sophisticated. She had been judged for her small-town roots, her unpolished accent, and her lack of familiarity with high society. That memory was a mirror, forcing Rebecca to see herself in a new light. Had she become the very thing she once despised? Meanwhile, James and Monica Bennett, continued to oversee the Equity and Excellence program. For them, it wasn't just about addressing what had happened on Flight 943. It was about ensuring no one else had to endure such treatment. They conducted surprise audits, interviewed staff at every level, and met with passengers to understand their experiences. One afternoon, as James sat in his office reviewing feedback reports, Monica entered, holding a tablet. "You need to see this," she said, sliding the device across the desk. James glanced at the screen. It was an anonymous letter from a flight attendant. The writer described how the program had forced them to confront their biases and grow as both a professional and a person. "I didn't realize how much I was holding on to stereotypes," the letter read. "This program has been uncomfortable, but it's made me better, not just at my job, but in how I see the world." James smiled faintly. "It's starting to work," he said. Monica nodded. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but this is a good start." Rebecca, too, was starting to feel that change. She had returned to work after completing her initial training sessions, but she wasn't the same person. Every interaction with passengers was now colored by a new awareness. She found herself questioning her assumptions, listening more closely, and treating every passenger as an individual rather than a category. It wasn't easy. On one flight, a businessman in a crisp suit snapped at her for taking too long to bring his drink. Rebecca felt the old instincts flare: dismissiveness, defensiveness, the urge to assert control. But instead, she took a breath and said, "I'm sorry for the delay. Let me get that for you right away." The man's demeanor softened instantly. "Thank you," he said, his tone less sharp. Rebecca felt a flicker of pride, not in herself, but in the power of choosing kindness over reaction. One day, Rebecca received an email that made her stomach drop. It was an invitation to a leadership reflection seminar, with James and Monica Bennett as the keynote speakers. Attendance was mandatory for senior staff, and Rebecca's name was on the list. The seminar was held in a grand conference room at SkyVantage's headquarters. The walls were adorned with photos of smiling crews and luxurious cabins, a reminder of the airline's commitment to excellence. Rebecca took a seat near the back, her heart pounding as she waited for the Bennetts to appear. When they finally stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. James was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his demeanor commanding but approachable. Monica stood beside him, her poise and elegance radiating confidence. "Good afternoon," James began, his voice steady. "We're here to talk about something that's often uncomfortable but necessary: accountability." He paused, letting the word sink in. Accountability isn't about assigning blame. It's about recognizing where we fall short and taking action to do better. 2 months ago, my family and I experienced something that reminded us why accountability matters, not just in business, but in every interaction we have. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the weight of his words. She glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else felt as exposed as she did. Monica stepped forward, her voice warm but firm. "We all have biases," she said. "It's human nature. But what defines us is how we choose to address them. That's why we created the Equity in Excellence program, not to shame or punish, but to grow. To ensure that every passenger, every employee, every human being is treated with dignity and respect." The room erupted into applause, but Rebecca felt a lump in her throat. For the first time, she saw the Bennetts not as adversaries, but as leaders, people who had turned their personal experience into an opportunity for transformation. After the seminar, Rebecca lingered near the back of the room, debating whether to approach the Bennetts. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Melissa, her younger colleague, smiling encouragingly. "You should talk to them," Melissa said. Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. She took a deep breath and walked toward the stage, where James and Monica were speaking with a group of executives. When they noticed her, they turned their full attention to her, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," Rebecca began, her voice trembling slightly. I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the way I treated you and your family. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, and I realize now how wrong I was. James studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. Thank you for saying that, Miss Carrington. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong. Monica offered a small smile. Growth isn't easy, but it's worth it. We hope this experience has taught you as much as it's taught us. Rebecca shook their hands, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude. She walked away from the conversation with a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about salvaging her career. It was about becoming the kind of person she could be proud of. In the months that followed, Rebecca became an advocate for the Equity in Excellence program, sharing her story with colleagues and mentoring younger flight attendants. Her journey wasn't without setbacks, but she approached each challenge with humility and determination. For the Bennetts, the transformation of SkyVantage was a victory, not because it erased the past, but because it ensured a better future. And for Rebecca, the incident on Flight 943 became the turning point she never knew she needed, a moment that reshaped her career, her perspective, and her life. One step at a time. A new horizon. 6 months after the events of Flight 943, the ripple effects of the Equity in Excellence program were evident across SkyVantage Airlines. Employee satisfaction scores were up. Customer reviews highlighted the airline's renewed focus on personalized service, and diversity workshops had become a cornerstone of the company's culture. For James and Monica Bennett, this transformation wasn't just about improving their airline. It was a way to honor their values and instill them in an industry that often resisted change. Rebecca Carrington was no longer the flight attendant she had been when she stepped onto Flight 943. The journey of self-reflection and growth had been both humbling and liberating. She had embraced the discomfort of confronting her biases and emerged with a stronger sense of purpose. Today, Rebecca stood at the gate of another international flight, her posture as straight and professional as ever. But this time, her smile was genuine, and her interactions with passengers carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Good evening, sir. Welcome aboard," she said to a businessman in a tailored suit, then turned to a young woman juggling a baby and a diaper bag. "Here, let me help you with that." The woman gave her a grateful smile. "Thank you." As Rebecca continued to greet passengers, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her job hadn't changed, but her approach to it had. Each interaction was an opportunity to make someone feel valued, and that, she realized, was the heart of hospitality. Meanwhile, James and Monica Bennett were preparing for another milestone: SkyVantage Airlines' first ever Diversity and Inclusion Summit. The event, hosted at the company's headquarters, would bring together industry leaders, employees, and passengers to discuss the future of inclusivity in aviation. As the Bennetts walked into the packed conference hall, they were greeted with applause. Monica, dressed in an elegant navy suit, stepped up to the podium first. "Good morning," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "Today is not just about celebrating how far we've come. It's about acknowledging how far we still have to go. Inclusion isn't a destination, it's a journey. And we're committed to walking that journey every single day." James took the stage next, his tone as steady and commanding as ever. "6 months ago, we faced a challenge that forced us to look inward and ask difficult questions. The changes we've made since then are a testament to the resilience and integrity of our team. But let me be clear, our work is never done." The audience erupted into applause, and James and Monica exchanged a quiet, knowing smile. Rebecca watched the summit's live stream during her layover, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. The Bennetts had become a source of inspiration for her, not just as leaders, but as people who embodied grace and determination in the face of adversity. Later that week, Rebecca received an unexpected email. It was an invitation to attend a private reception with the Bennetts and senior staff members, a recognition of her personal growth and contribution to the Equity in Excellence program. The reception was held in an elegant event space overlooking the city skyline, Rebecca arrived feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by Melissa, who had become one of her closest allies over the past few months. "I'm so proud of you," Melissa said, giving her a quick hug. "You've come so far." Rebecca smiled, her eyes scanning the room. At the center stood James and Monica, surrounded by executives and employees, their presence as commanding as ever. When Rebecca finally approached them, James turned to her with a welcoming smile. "Ms. Carrington," he said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you." "Please, call me Rebecca," she replied, shaking his hand. "And thank you for everything. I don't think I'd be standing here today if it weren't for you." Monica's smile was warm. "Rebecca, you did the work. We just created the space for it. That's what leadership is about, empowering others to grow." Rebecca nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "I'm grateful for the second chance you gave me. I won't waste it." James' expression softened. "We don't believe in throwing people away for their mistakes. Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and do better." As they spoke, Rebecca felt a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. The events of Flight 943 were no longer a source of shame. They were the catalyst for a transformation that had reshaped not only her career, but also her identity. In the months and years that followed, Rebecca rose to new heights within SkyVantage Airlines. She became a trainer for new hires, sharing her story as a testament to the power of humility, reflection, and growth. Her journey inspired others to embrace change, not as a threat, but as an opportunity. The Bennetts, too, continued their work, expanding the Equity and Excellence program into a model for other industries. Their commitment to fairness and dignity became the cornerstone of their legacy, a reminder that leadership is not about power, it's about responsibility. On a crisp spring morning, Rebecca boarded a flight bound for Tokyo, this time as a senior flight trainer. As she walked through the cabin, she greeted passengers with a smile that was no longer just a part of her uniform. It was a reflection of who she had become. In the back of her mind, she thought of James and Monica Bennett, their calm strength, and the grace with which they had handled everything. She whispered a quiet thank you to the universe, knowing she would carry their lessons with her forever. As the plane soared into the sky, Rebecca felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her journey wasn't over, but she was finally heading in the right direction, one step at a time.